Hey folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and this past week I took a little holiday to relax and really get inside my own head, and while I was there I found this. What if M&Ms ate people like candy? Now, with the birth of a totally reasonable idea, I then have to figure out how best to present it to the world. For instance, would the M&M be a normal-sized chocolate candy that eats tiny people? Or do we now live in some sort of alternate universe that is controlled by massive sentient M&Ms that pose an ever-present threat to humanity? I'm not wholly sure yet, so for the time being, I'm just gonna make a fist-sized flattened sphere and go from there. I'll start by poking some nice big eyeball pits for my candy-coated eyeballs, which I'll make and add later, but for now this will help me figure out the proper placement for my mouth. Once I've carved an appropriately sized people hole, I can start to hollow it out by removing any of the excess clay before coming back with a series of ball styluses and sculpting tools to give the inside of the mouth as much of a realistic and fleshy appearance as I can be bothered giving it. I think it would be a nice touch to have my M&M dumping a handful of little people into his open gob, so it's worth adding plenty of detail here. Otherwise, I've rolled and pre-baked a couple big eyeballs off camera that I can then press aggressively into place before beginning the process of adding copious wormy dealies around the eyeballs to really build up the wrinkles and folds. I'll then carry the wormy dealy wrinklification outwards to the rest of the body, adding plenty of chocolatey skin folds and sugary creases before adding some little worms to the top of his eyes to make my M&M look a little less enthusiastic. Before I get to making his teeth, I need to give him some big gums, so I'm gonna add a couple of chunky worms to the inside of his mouth, then blend them in. Finally, I figured if Red's gonna be open-mouthed like this, his left eye should probably be pretty squinty, so I'll add a little bit of clay until it looks right. Otherwise, it's time to make some teeth. To make my teeth, I'll roll some translucent clay into a bunch of teeny tiny blobs. Then I can carefully shape them into some nice tooth-shaped shapes by way of poking and prodding until I've got a set of lovely off-white chompers. Once they've been baked, I can pop them off the baking tray and start pressing them into my gums. Finally, with a full set of beautiful teeth, Red's ready for a pre-booze smoothing followed by a once-over with isopropyl alcohol to blend the edges, soften any of the sharp tool lines, and remove leftover fingerprints. Then I can jam some armature wire into his underside to make his initial baking a little easier. Once he's out of the oven, I can pop his teeth out and set them aside for later. Then I can reshape his legs a bit before mounting him on a sculpting block. Once in place, I'll find the optimal people-eating pose, then get to work bulking out his legs. In the original design, his legs don't have a whole lot of detail, and I'm gonna stick with that, but instead of giving him his traditional white sneakers, I thought it might be a bit more fun to give him some overly detailed human feet. Finally, with my feet looking pretty smart, I can get to work on his arms, starting by drilling a couple of holes to fit some armature wire. Once I've got my arms in place and appropriately posed, I can give them the same soft, minimally detailed coverings that the legs got. However, I like the idea that he's wearing great big gloves since it adds a bit of backstory. Where did he get these gloves? Are they separate from his body? And why are they the only piece of clothing he wears? I've heard that good art makes you ask questions, and if you don't have a whole bunch of questions after this, then I don't know what to tell you. Otherwise, at this point, I've decided that this version of Red is going to be the size of a building, so to give a nice sense of scale, I thought maybe instead of a package of M&Ms, he can be holding a bus full of people. Of course, that means I need to make a teeny tiny bus, and to get the shape of said bus, I'm going to use these slightly chamfered wooden blocks, which I can drape a sheet of extra thin clay over top of. I'll cut the sides and front so they're all the same height, then I can chop out 4 equally spaced wheel wells, add some bus top greeblies, and finally very carefully remove some big sections of clay where my windows will go. Otherwise, with the frame mostly built, I can throw it all in the oven to cure, then carefully remove it from the block. To make the bottom of the bus, I'll use the frame as a guide to cut out a thin rectangle of clay, mark out where my wheels line up, then begin adding the details to the interior floor. Otherwise, Red's going to be holding the bus aloft, so the underside will be visible, so I want to make sure that all the bits and bobs that make up the chassis are perfect. This also gives me a chance to show off my intricate knowledge of all things vehicular, starting with the framing beam that runs the length of the chassis, followed by the bottom knob, then the wheel bones, which gets covered in this roundy bit. I'll make sure to add some pipes leading to the gas tank, as well as add the engine testicles, plenty of robot vanes, and this random square. And there you have a near-perfect 1-to-1 miniature replica of a standard bus belly. To make the seats, I'll cut some thin strips off a pre-baked sheet of extra thin clay, then cut those strips into even shorter strips before gluing them onto another strip and cutting that strip down again. Then I'll glue a little spacer onto the bottom, leaving me with adorable little bus seats ready to be glued onto my bus floor. Now, I didn't think it makes much sense for Red to be holding a bus he's already emptied out, so to keep things realistic, I'll make a whole bunch of teeny tiny people that I can put inside the bus that Red will be saving for a future snack. I'm not going to be making them overly detailed, both because they'll be barely visible inside the bus, and because making a bunch of highly detailed people takes a long time and this video is already a week late. Instead, I'm going to make some vaguely humanoid shapes of varying colors that I can simply paint some clothing onto later. For now, I'll mash them into place, bake everything once more to cure it, and get to painting. I'll give the inside of the bus a white base coat with my airbrush before painting the walkway with a strip of non-slip black flooring. The backs of the seats get a dirty black wash, while the cushions will get a lovely blue top coat. I forgot to spray the bus exterior white, so I'll do a dozen coats with my brush, followed by another couple coats of red everywhere else. To make the windows, I'll cut a couple strips of plastic packaging down to the correct size, draw on some black lines to separate the windows, then chip and chop with my pliers so they look smashed up before gluing them into place. I want the front of the bus to be torn off so Red can get at the people inside, so I've added some broken windows to the front and broken up the clay a little bit more. Otherwise, the details are done, so I can start to add the rest of the paint, starting with a gunmetal gray on the bottom and around any of the broken pieces, as well as the greeblies on top. Finally, my freshly painted teeny tiny people are ready to be stuck into place at the back of the bus and hanging off the seats, as well as stuck to the back of the frame itself. Then I can glue my two bus parts together and add some wheels. Finally, I'll add some final finishing touches by way of brake lights and some little yellow indicators on the sides. With that, my bus is finished and I can use it to give Red's right hand the correct shape. Finally, I can wrap a little worm around the wrist to make it a glove before adding Red's left hand, which will be palm open, finger splayed, like it would be if you were to pour a handful of M&Ms into your mouth. Or if you were to pour a handful of people. Then, once it's all been baked, I can finally start to paint, beginning with several coats of red until red is actually red. I'll follow that red with more red, but a slightly darker red that I'll readily apply to Red's recesses to add a bit of recess shading. While I've got my airbrush out, I'll also give the inside of his mouth a pinkish base coat, which I'll follow with several shades of lighter pinks and purples and blues until it's kind of fleshy looking, before getting to work applying a half dozen coats of white to make my legs, arms, hands, and feet a nice pure white. I'll do the same to the eyeballs before taking my time to sketch out what I think is a pretty darn perfect M on his belly. Now, I had considered giving him some bloodshot, cataracty white eyeballs, but decided to go with the character-correct black pupils. Finally, to give a bit of shading to the arms and legs, I'll paint the whole surface with a thin gray wash before dabbing away the excess with a sponge. And with the majority of the painting done, I can start to return the teeth to their original places. To give the teeth a bit of color, I'll paint them with an umber wash, then using a cotton bud, I'll rub it away to give it a nice gradient. Finally, a coat of UV resin will give the eyes a nice glossy shine, and I can add his incredibly off-putting eyebrows. However, despite being more accurate to the original design, I decided he looked better without them, so I'll end up popping them off at the end. Last but not least, I'll give the teeth and mouth a nice glossy varnish. Now, sometimes I'll buy a pack of M&Ms and eat them in the store, and I wanted to make it seem like that's kind of what Red's doing as well. So I'm gonna make him standing on the road that this particularly unfortunate bus was driving down. I'll start with a block of foam and then pull off sections of the foam to give it a bit more of an interesting texture beneath the asphalt. Then I'll cover the top in glue so that I can glue said asphalt on top, and to make that asphalt, I'm just gonna use some high-grit sandpaper. Once the glue is dried, I'll use some painter's tape to mark out the center line that will be my road markings. Then I can use a sponge to haphazardly slap a layer of yellow paint down between the tape. Then I'll use a series of blacks and grays dry brushed over the sandpaper to give the surface a bit of a dusty, worn appearance before painting some more white lines on the sides. Then it's back to dry brushing and sponging to dirty it up even more before some final messy brown oily streaks to tie it all together. All that's left to do then is stick Red in place, glue my bust into his right hand, and then add a handful of people to his left hand. Otherwise, I think that's probably enough for this one, so we're on to the Glamour Shots. As always, a big ol' thank you to my lovely patrons over on Patreon, and a very special shout out to my newest patrons, Jessica Dye, Abrams, Miles Case, Cassidy Bales, Cosmic Death 52, Stoft, Marion MacArthur, Dominika Sakzawa, Tobias Holtker, Levi en Rose, Aryoshi, James Charles, Kelly Brown, Sean Parker, Andrew Nasca Medeiros, Ben Graham, Russ Dove 4, Vanny, Selkis89, Dom, Just Wackadoodle Me, Icarus, Captain Fruit Loop, Joseph Cottle, Captain Splashclaw, Linzu, Lucy McCormick, Haven't Slept, Ryan Moed, Tom Burns, Kissy Don, Kylie Sickles, Daniel Howard, Delmont Ryder, Ronnie Jenkins, More Caffeine Hobby Hour, Annie Mal, and Jared Fleet. You are the crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside city bus that fuels this channel. If you're one of the people that emailed me last week making sure I was still alive, I appreciate your concern, and I assure you, I'm still very much kicking. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.